Welcome to the UGC EPG Pathshala lecture series in computer science. In this series of lectures, we are looking at a subject software engineering, and for today's session we will be looking at requirements engineering. The major objectives that are planned for today's session would be to give a general introduction of requirements engineering process, to describe the principal requirements engineering activities and their relationships, to introduce the concepts of user and system requirements, to describe functional and non-functional requirements. First, let us try to understand what is software requirement. In case if you are about to develop a software or a product, we may have to continuously understand the requirements from the client. First, we may have to plot know your customers. So, who are supposed to be the end users who will be using this product, and what percentage of people might use this product becomes a question. So, those people are supposed to be called stakeholders. Requirements gives a clear understanding of what is to be developed by way of understanding from the customer on the product development. Here comes the first software requirement, a complete description of what the software system will do without describing how it will do. So, whenever a software requirements need to be plotted, it talks more about what is to be prepared rather than how it is to be developed, which means the customer will project us with clear understanding of what is required for them as the output. But then the logical issues are not pertinent from the customer's end. So, major of what is to be done will be initially projected from the customer's level, and a team, as far as agile is concerned, or a traditional team of developers, project managers, team leaders will look at what is to be developed. Later part of it, after understanding the complete requirements, they will go for design, where at the design it will be thought about how it should be developed. Software requirements may generally be abstract statements of services. So, anything that we wish to develop, say initially from the user ID and password, those are mentioned to be as abstract services from the customer's level, and it is a part of bit of contract. So, every feature that we were talking about in the previous session, like user stories, need to be bid for a contract purpose, or it could be either a contract by itself and part of technical document which describes a complete portion of a document. So, as a resultant of this software requirement, what we will be developing is the software requirement specification, which is majorly abbreviated as SRS. The industry specifies this SRS, only then it enters a list of team members or to the developers who will be given the task of what is to be developed. So, software requirements gives a complete specification of what is to be developed. So, there are major sources of requirements which need to be understood. One, from the stakeholders perspective. Two, we may have to prepare list of documents which would help in understanding what this product need to understand with and behave with, and what is existing. So, existing system need also to be understood, and the application domain over which this can effectively run. So, these are the four sources of requirements which would be helpful during the time of a plotting. Talking the importance of software requirements, in 1994, a Standish Group survey study, the first three most commonly cited factors that caused projects to be challenged. One is on the lack of user input. Whenever we look at the requirements, we study either the requirements as functional requirements or non-functional requirements. If suppose if it is majorly conceived as a functional requirement, then I will list out a list of features. These features would include user inputs. Software can never be estimated in terms of number of lines of code that we write. I cannot say that a software is really worth if it is written for say 10,000 lines of code for today. Rather, the major functionalities involved during the software development needs to be accounted. So, instead of lines of code, now that I try to convert every software into functional aspects. So, these functional aspects dominates during the development phase. So, the challenges that we face during the software requirements, as a first point, we have lack of user inputs. These user inputs majorly concentrate 13% of the overall project estimate. Whereas, if in case I have left out with some of the requirements and I start developing, so which means I am incomplete with my requirements and specification, and 12% of the projects becomes challenged if in case we have not addressed with these projects. So, the major challenge that would cause at the end would be on incomplete project, or I will have overrun of time, overrun of estimate cost. So, these can be avoided majorly working on these life cycle models. So, as such, if you have looked at waterfall model, we have looked at all these challenges. Because of these challenges, it would be always nice that we collect all the requirements from the customer way in the beginning, but there are not projects, unique projects which can take up all the requirements in the beginning. So, we instantly talk about incomplete requirements in the beginning, but then 12% of the projects even now gets challenged because of these incomplete requirements. The other thing is about the requirements change. Because of agile processing, agile can incorporate those changes and respond to those changes, because it is very much conceived from the customer's point of view itself. As part of Scrum, if you could recall, Scrum involves the active participation of the customer. So, customer would give a large perspective of what is to be developed. So, with an interim development, this can happen. Whereas, if you look at waterfall model, a traditional development life cycle model, where the changing requirements may not be largely accommodated. So, changing requirements and specification also concentrates to be 12% of the all projects, which is also to be challenged. Sometimes people might feel, the figure that I have shown, sometimes people might feel I am so busy, I do not want to waste much of my time collecting all the requirements in the beginning. So, because of these words, sometimes we may end up in issues which projects saying many a times requirements are not fulfilled or not collected and complete. So, that might lead to a bad result or a cost overrun or a time overrun. Talking more about the importance of software requirements, thereafter the data diverges rapidly. Of course, your project also could fail. It is primarily because we were not able to accommodate major changes, because we were not able to respond to those changes, project might fail. So, because of unrealistic schedule or time frame, 4% of the projects cited in this leads to failure. Inadequate staffing and resources, because I haven't planned for the change of requirements, for modification of specifications, because of which the staff and the infrastructure that is to be developed may not be planned. So, because of that, projects might fail. Inadequacy of technology skills. Sometimes the customer might request us to develop incorporate new change in technologies. Every now and then we get used to a lot of tools. Because of change of technology, the developers basically need to be trained initially so as to satisfy the customers. So because of which inadequate technology skills, the project might fail. So these are some of the reasons by where if we have not collected software requirements, project might fail, or we give most importance to the collection of requirements. A survey shows that at least 1/3 of development projects run into trouble for reasons that are directly related to collection of requirements, that is requirements gathering, proper documentation of these requirements, that is requirements documentation, and management of all these requirements, which is requirements management. If we fail to do all these three aspects well ahead before starting with the project, there may be a possibility of failure towards a project. Now we will look at the frequency of requirement errors. So the origin of defects. This table gives you a clear picture of the different stages that we will flow through for the development of projects, from requirements, design, coding, documentation, bad fixes. The defect potential, although it seems to be heavy, removal efficiency is too less when compared to the other aspects, but then delivered defects will be too heavy when you are working with requirements. It is basically because of this gap which has not been addressed in the beginning of software projects. We fail to deliver the exact requirement posted by our customer. So in that particular case, the delivered product leads with a lot of defects by where the customer will not feel much satisfactory. So it is better to address all the requirements and bridge the gap between the customer and the team in the beginning. So requirements error top the delivered defects and contribute approximately 1/3 of the total delivered defects to the defect pile. Since requirements happen early in the cycle of software development, there may be a high chance when there is a change of software or change of requirements, when there is any traceability that needs to be done in terms of defect, then the cost of development becomes high, because we are trying to iteratively, or we are coming back in the entire loop starting from the beginning. So there might be a high cost of requirement errors. So because of which, let us see how much it would get impact. Defects discovered at the requirements analysis phase, where it will be 74% of the requirements oriented defects would cost heavily, whereas at the high level design, if we are about to plot the error and work on it, it costs 4% of the requirement defects leak, and that 7% leak further into detailed design. The leakage continues throughout the life cycle, and a total of 4% of requirement error aren't found until maintenance, when the system is released to the customers and is likely to full scale operation. So because of these errors, where does this requirements lead to? The requirements basically leads us to re-specify what is wanted afresh, redesign, recode, retest, and change the order of execution of unit based work, modularized work. Corrective actions need to be performed. Sometimes because of these change of errors, the developers may not be able to plot where exactly to start with, and the work done by the developers may lead to a scrap of the entire activity. Warranty cost, product liability and service cost, documentation. So almost like if we have found out errors at the requirements phase, we may have to rework on every single module then on, so which may cost too heavily which may run on time in a drastic manner. After clearly understanding on the software requirements, now that we will generally understand the various types of requirements that a software has got. As I have indicated already, there are two different types of requirements from the software. One is on the functional aspect of it, the other one would be on the non-functional aspects. If you could recall my statements earlier, I have said software cannot be measured in terms of number of lines of code, as in the case of exercises that we do as a part of laboratory 1. But then software need to be estimated in terms of the number of functionalities that it has got, or the number of features that the software incorporates. So this is one type of software requirement which describes set of inputs, behavior and output. So functionalities talk majorly on the behavior of how the software should respond if provided such an input, and what exactly is required from the customer's end as an output. So this functional requirement in turn calculates, provides technical details, manipulates and process specific functionalities that define what a system is supposed to accomplish. As I have indicated, a requirement spec is majorly to concentrate on what a system has to do, and this functional requirements provide us a clean understanding of what the system has to do by way of clearly mentioning the technical details, manipulation details, processing details and some calculation that would rather incorporated towards the software engineering. Functional requirement should be more or less complete and consistent right from the beginning. Customers and developers usually focus all their attention initially towards functional requirements. Say as part of functional requirements, maybe I can collect the user input as one of the requirement, the expected output that the system has to provide as one of the functional requirement. The system takes this as a logic, that means the technical details that will be provided for it. It can even take out the queries that will be provided towards the system, assuming all the queries, that can also be a functionality which will be incorporated. It can even take up interfaces, some external interfaces that need to be sought towards effective working, say in terms of tools, in terms of process. It can adopt towards development of this particular activity, that also will be part of this functional requirement. So functional requirement would basically involve user input, user output, user queries, logic files which highlights on the technical details and interface files. So these component would mention on how the system has to behave given a provision of application domain. And the second type of software requirement that we have is the non-functional requirement, where the quality of the system need to be understood. Unless we are working for a software project, it is towards defining the quality of the software that need to be clearly picturized. So non-functional requirements talk more about quality of the product. So to give a better quality product, non-functional requirements segregate its characteristic as product requirements, process requirements and external requirements. Product requirements concentrate majorly on the usability of the project. As I have told you in the beginning, once having conceived the project, we may have to basically look at who are the end users who will be using this project, how comfortably they can use it. Today we go for an online purchase and we look at those websites which are very much usable and friendly. So usability requirement need to be collected. It also looks at efficiency requirements, which involves performance and space requirements. Not only that, these product requirements also concentrate on portability. Some browsers may not support this. So whenever I am trying to develop software, this should be portable to any machine and any spec. And reliability, how much this software is reliable working with, maybe in terms of security, maybe in terms of all other aspects. So these would concentrate majorly towards product requirements. The other thing would be on the process requirements, where we will look at delivery requirements. So what need to be delivered at what point in time. Say if a product, one module of a product is being delivered, so this is to be given highest priority, so it is being delivered. The second one is on the implementation requirements, and the third one would be on the accomplishing standards. So what standards I maintain? Yesterday we talked about coding standards. Likewise, is my development incorporating all standards that are to be maintained at the requirement, design, coding phases, that also need to be checked for. And towards external requirements, I will be concentrating majorly on interoperability, where between systems how much it is operable, and it looks for ethical requirements also, and legislative requirements like privacy requirements and safety requirements. So as such, with the non-functional requirements, I will be talking more on the product requirements, process requirements and external requirements, whereas when I talk about functional requirements, I will be talking about the technical details relating to the project. We may have to provide a team for effective requirement management. Although we have conceived the entire work from the beginning, that happens only at the higher level. But basically we have to form a very good team, so that they are properly trained first, and they develop the product very effectively. So this team management is a very good concern as a software requirement. So the basic skills that are required for a requirement engineer are: the requirements engineer should basically analyze on the given problem, understand who the users are, understanding who the customers are, that is knowing your customers KYC, and your stakeholders needs, defining every part of the system, understanding the vision of the system and managing the scope of the system, refining the system definition, building the right system. So these would be the major concentration that the requirements engineer in the development team would look at. After understanding all the skills, what are the tasks that these requirements engineering must do? Requirements engineer basically needs to define the business needs, identify the project stakeholders and user classes, elicit the requirements from the customers, analyze on the requirements, write specification based on the collected requirements and the analysis document, model on those requirements in case of use cases, lead all the specification that has been given towards validation, because validation is very much important, whether this part of it is correct and fitting to this project or not need to be tested, and facilitate prioritization, mentioning these modules are to be given highest priority when compared to the other modules. Prioritization need to be given highest importance, and we may have to manage all the requirements right from the beginning. Now we will look at the process of requirements engineering. As such, when we look at requirements engineering, it is not just about collection of the entire requirements only from the customer. Although we say collection of requirements, it should be basically understandable from the developer perspective also. So these requirements engineering process runs through 4 phases which are mentioned here. So for managing all the requirements, stakeholders participation is very much essential, and to manage the requirements we have 4 phases which happens iteratively, which means in the initial stage I elicit all the requirements, work on the requirements in terms of analysis, properly document those requirements so as to give a contract agreement mentioning what are the features that will be supported as part of this software, and validate on the requirements. So this happens in a loop. Elicitation being the first process of this requirements engineering works with customer on gathering the entire phase of requirements. So we try to gather as much as possible from the stakeholders, we try to understand what their requirements are, we try to manage it in the initial cases. Then it is passed on for elaboration, where we analyze each and every feature that has been mentioned by my customer. So this elaboration process provides us with an information to understand it, classify that in various categories and relate the customer needs to possible software requirements. Then we specify exactly what has been analyzed or what has been elaborated, now that this has been prepared as a complete specification. So with the specification, I will be looking at the structure of the customer, structure of customer's input and derived requirements as written documents and diagrams. So by specification, I would provide you with a rough plot on how these requirements should flow through, either in case of a flow chart or in case of a plotting a pseudo code or in case of writing use cases and so. Further, it will be validated. So all these happens within the elicitation phase itself. So whatever that I have collected at the elicitation needs to be elaborated, specified and validated. So this validation, where the developer will ask the customer to confirm that what they have given as a specification is accurate and complete to correct as errors. So that this tries to bridge the gap between what has been provided from the customer end and what the developer has understood from his perspective. So these 4 steps in the requirements engineering help us understand what is to be conceived. So when we are looking out with the entire requirements process, we talk requirements engineering process as eliciting requirements, analyzing requirements, documenting the same. This documenting we call the output of the documentation as SRS, which is software requirement specification, and finally we try to validate on these requirements. In summary, in this particular session we have concentrated on the foundations of requirements engineering, where we have said requirements engineering is to talk more about what of the process rather than how it is to be developed, and we have looked at the different sources by where we get the requirements. Basically we get the requirements from the stakeholders, and we have provided the importance of requirements, where in case of error, where all the requirements will be challenging has been mentioned, and later part of it we have looked at the type of requirements, where I have given it as in 2 classes. One is the functional requirements and the other one is non-functional requirements. As a final case, we have projected on the requirements engineering process, which ran through as 4 individual states, right from the collecting from the stakeholders, then it should be managed. So it is managed in terms of eliciting the requirements, analyzing the requirements, documenting the requirements, and then finally validating with the customer so as to proceed to the next phase called design. Thank you.